Good evening and welcome to the Logos broadcast. It's Sunday, the 8th of November, and I'm very lucky to be joined by two keen observers of all things American politics. John Waters and Kevin O'Rourke are their names. And of course, we are here to discuss this year's presidential election. Joe Biden has been declared President of the United States, and while his supporters celebrate this victory, others wonder if there might be more to the story. So, Kevin, I would like to begin with you and say, do you have any reason to believe that there are further developments in this story that might change the outcome, or do you have faith in the system as it has worked to date?
No, we can't say for sure at this point. Obviously, 20 years ago, Al Gore thought he was the president for a little over a month before the courts turned it over. I have heard and read sort of stories from non-mainstream sources that, for example, Joe Biden did an awful lot worse than, say, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama did in most urban centers, except the few that he needed to leapfrog Donald Trump at 4 a.m. Another thing I read was that I think in Philadelphia something like 80,000 ballots came in with just Joe Biden, but no Democratic senators voted for. Which, yeah, it's entirely possible. Those are just people who didn't really care about the Senate very much. But it will be very interesting to watch what happens over the next few weeks or so. Because while we don't have any proof either way, I suppose it is at least plausible, and we should at least look into it. It is quite important if there is any legitimate question over irregularities with number of votes, that they be looked into properly, so that either way, once it's over, we have a very sort of definitive answer, and you don't have sort of half America thinking that the election was stolen from the one way or the other.
John,
of course that might happen.
Yes, exactly, John.
Of course that might happen anyway.
No matter what the result, exactly. Yeah, people were saying that there'd be unrest one way or the other. But John, can you tell me about your experience on Tuesday night? You stayed up very late and witnessed.
I just want to. There's one very important, or a couple of very important things there, just about the kind of phraseology you're using there. You say that I think that the election has been declared for Joe Biden, but actually, well, you have to ask who declared it. Well, the CNN declared it. PA, all media organizations declared it. Now, that has no legal standing whatsoever. That's just part of an information war that is going on, has been going on, and has to do a lot with two things. First of all, there's the fact that there's a kind of an anomalous situation with the American system as compared to, say, the British or Irish system, which we'd be more familiar with, where in the Irish and British systems, the media are really observers of a process, which is a formal official process. In the American system, the official process is there, the certification process is, but it's kind of standing back and is leaving the stage to the media to more or less declare results on the basis of the evidence that's on the screen in front of them. So there's a different thing. So the system, when you say the system, then there isn't actually a system at play here at all, other than the media system. And that's the second part of it then is that we know that the media is unbelievably, unprecedentedly partisan in relation to Donald Trump, and that in general the media has gone rogue under all kinds of headings in America and elsewhere with regard to basically telling the truth. Because what they're actually now trying to do is become players in various stories and present stories in such a way that their outcome, their favorite outcome, will triumph in the end. And so that's the first thing that we said about that. So that's kind of what's happened. That's where we are. There's a game going on. CNN declared it so that before Arizona was decided, because if Arizona was decided for Trump, which is most likely, the psychological balance would shift. So that's
what about, not to cut across, but what about Fox, John? Because they seem to be accepting things.
Completely rogue. But you see, the interesting thing is that a lot of the Irish and British media, for example, are following this as though it were the same as an Irish election. I mean, things don't get into the public arena really until the returning officer stands up on the stage and reads out figures. That's in Ireland, you know. That doesn't happen in the American system for whatever reasons, which I don't really understand that, because I think they're going to have to go back to something like that. But anyway, it's much more complicated, lots more stuff. But just to go back to your question, Tuesday night, I mean, I'm a bit woolly after the actual times in American, because I mean, we're talking about different times in different places, but just, you know, mindful that we're 5 hours ahead of New York and 8 hours ahead of Los Angeles. I kind of started in the early hours, started tuning in, and the very early hours, it was kind of like, you know, a little bit uncertain, because the figures, the votes that were in at that stage were pretty much all postal votes. They were the ones that were counted, and they seemed to favor Biden. But then as the on the day votes started to roll in, the balance shifted very quickly, and it was quite clear that Trump was doing amazingly well, much, much, much better than any pollster or media organization had given any expectation of doing. And in fact, he was exceeding his vote of 2016 quite dramatically in some places. And there was something very strange as the night wore on. Like, I mean, when we got to about 3 o'clock, it became noticeable that the number that the scoreboard started to be, it became static. And there was nobody was giving anything to Trump. Biden was apparently ahead. I can't remember the exact figures, but he was about, I think, 30 electoral college points, as opposed to what he needs is 270, right? And Trump was less, just over 200. And it was static at that, I think 213. So it was static at that for several hours. And then odd things started to happen. Like Pennsylvania was suspended for the night. And Biden came out and made a speech. He didn't claim the election, but he was, you know, it was a very strange speech, because it was quite extraordinary, because he was reading clearly from an autocue. His wife was standing beside him with a mask on, and she was whispering to him instructions or something. He was reading from this autocue. And it appeared that on the autocue, there was an instruction between each paragraph to Joe Biden to smile, which he did. And there was this extraordinary thing where he was very serious reading, and then suddenly he would go, and then he would switch off the slide and go on and read the next paragraph. So this is just bizarre stuff, right? And then somewhat later, then Trump came out and started to talk about fraud. And by then it was clear there was something seriously wrong. So at about 6 o'clock, nothing moved. Nothing was moving whatsoever. I mean, normally, like, I remember the last election, we were in Chicago for the last count, and it was kind of over by midnight, pretty much, or one of the early hours. It was all over. Trump had been elected, and that was that. It was clear. So it just kind of froze. Something seriously had happened, and we didn't know what. So I went to bed and I kind of thought, well, by 9 o'clock it's going to be over. I got up, nothing had changed, except suddenly there was this talk about 138,000 votes turning up in Wisconsin, out of the blue, that nobody had talked about before. 138,000, and 96% of those were for Joe Biden. So, you know, it was all beginning to look very strange and very fishy. And you know, I think that if you actually stand back from it, really, this election, you see, if the media creates so much noise that there's no possibility at this stage for any players or anybody around, or even any officialdom, to actually speak louder than that. There's no like authority that can voice CNN. So what you're getting then is actually a false narrative, I would say. I'm not saying ultimately that it will, I do believe it will be ultimately disproven, but it may not be. It's possible that it wouldn't be. But what I'm saying is that, you know, it's a very strange situation that this can happen in the election in the biggest democracy in the world, that this could be allowed to happen. But it has happened, and I think it's going to last the full month. I think the cutoff point is the 6th of December. with a
So
couple
the
of
electoral college actually gets together.
Pardon?
That's when the electoral college actually gets together to.
Well, that's when the
Vote
final, everything has to be wrapped up. Everything that isn't decided, then the court has to decide. I think there's a 2-day grace period into the 8th, and at the 8th, there's an absolute cutoff point. The Supreme Court will then rule. And if it cannot resolve it then, it goes to the House, and the House will actually then have to vote on who will become the next president. And that's never, I think that's happened once before in the history of America. But you see, I think this is really, the story here is really not so much about the election, it's about the media. It's about the fact that the media have insinuated themselves as a player in a democratic process and are using their power. And I don't mean just the legacy media, also social media, which is censoring the president's tweets, stopping newspapers. For the last month, the New York Post had a series of reports which they tried to tweet about the Hunter Biden situation. And Twitter actually just took down their Twitter feed and then lied about it. And so these are bizarre times. I mean, I blame Trump to some extent for this because he could have sorted this out 2 years ago. Ted Cruz has been going through these big tech guys in the congressional hearings. He's been going through them for a shortcut, and he's incredible. If I was Trump, I would have sent him in. Said, just sort those guys out. Do whatever authority you need, you got it. Just sort them out. I don't want those people messing up our democracy anymore. And that would have put an end to all this.
No,
Here we are.
Yeah, Cruz, it's interesting you mention him because a lot of Republicans are effectively conceding Trump's defeat in this, but Cruz is one of them who's saying, let's hear the rest of the story.
Well, there's an interesting theory, Fergus, about why the Republicans are, which I've heard, and there's a certain kind of plausibility to it. That Trump made one of his missions to drain the swamp, right? Which is but everybody assumes that the swamp is just a Democratic Party, but of course it's not. It's also the Republican Party, parts of it. And the problem is these guys have had pretty lean years, 4 lean years now, no backhanders. And because Trump's watching everything, right? And they want to see the back of Trump as much as the Dems do, And that's the reality of it.
No one is safe.
Well, another thing.
Kevin, sorry, can I just ask you? You are quite muffled. Do you mind can you disconnect those headphones and see? Because the sound isn't great. Do you mind?
Yeah, Grant, give me a sec. Sorry. How about now?
That sounds much better, actually. Yeah. Can you keep going there?
Well, I suppose one other thing would be if it did turn out that there were widespread irregularities, would we actually know, and would America know what to do with that information? Because it would then potentially call into question elections going back quite a long time. Call into question policies that have been in place for quite a long time. It might be an awful lot easier just to ignore it, pretend it never happened, and just go on acting as if everything was normal.
I saw a video. Go on, John.
I don't know if that's true, because I think this is really exceptional. I mean, just to go through some of the issues that have arisen. There's a massive issue that's arisen in Pennsylvania and elsewhere about Republican observers not being permitted to get anywhere near the tables where votes are being counted, which is a mandatory legal requirement. And it has been, not only has it been kind of flouted completely, but the Republicans actually went to get to court and got a court order that they would be allowed within 6 feet of the tables. And what happened? Yes, they were allowed in, but the tables were moved 6 feet backwards. This is like so blatant, like that it's comedy at a certain level. That's one of the things. There's also talk about a piece of software that has been used in multiple states, which is apparently was a software developed by the CIA to interfere with other people's elections, which is an interesting sidebar on this. And now it's being applied domestically, which is annoying a lot of Americans in ways that they were never annoyed when it was simply being used in Central America or wherever the hell it was being used before. So that's another thing. There's talk actually also, there's actually a very interesting rumor going on. I don't believe this because it seems totally implausible, but there's been talk, you know, the way on the web, these kind of things sprout out and you think this could that be true? And the story is that actually Trump has set up a sting involving watermarks on the votes, and that there's an electronic watermark on every legitimate vote, and they know everywhere, every vote in the country, they know where it is or where it was. So, I mean, if that were true, I don't know if that's even possible. But it seems that there's been multiple fraudulent practices at play. You've got to look at the fact that Joe Biden has got more votes in multiple states than Barack Obama got. Now, you've got to ask yourself questions about that, don't you?
Well, in fairness, you're right. He's definitely not as charismatic as Obama, but at the same time, Trump is far more unpopular among certain people, and it did create, as someone put it to me the other day, this was more of a referendum on Donald Trump as opposed to an affirmation of support for someone like Joe Biden. Do you know, like there are ways to explain that, I think.
Yeah,
definitely.
No, that's right. I mean, it was the candidates were on the one hand Trump and the other hand not Trump.
Exactly, and the turnout was higher this election than it had been.
In fact, in some places it was about 105%, I've gathered, you know. So, you know, yeah, it was probably the highest turnout in American history, you know.
Well, Kevin, you mentioned the mainstream, and obviously there are sources outside of that, and one of these people is Steve Bannon, who is quite the character. And just by chance, I happened to be on an Irish radio show the other day, and I never really listened to the Irish radio, but I heard an ad or a promo for Drive Time with Cormac O'Hara, and he was saying that he was going to talk to Steve Bannon that afternoon. So this was on Tuesday, the day of the election, and subsequently Steve Bannon was banned from Twitter, and he had videos taken down from other places. And I'll just give you a quote. So it's just quite amazing, as John says, quite extraordinary that this guy was fit to be on Irish radio and all of a sudden unfit to be on Twitter. It just seemed quite bizarre. Business Insider had a headline: Steve Bannon loses his defense counsel after calling for the beheading of Dr. Fauci. So this sounds like something out of the Roman times or something. What do you know of this Bannon fella, Kevin?
To be honest, very little. I didn't. I hadn't heard much from him since he got fired by Donald Trump in 2017. I think. I know he was. He was kind of back a little bit with Rudy Giuliani and these hard drives supposedly from Hunter Biden's laptops. But I wasn't personally that aware that Steve Bannon was making a massive contribution that wouldn't have been made without him there. You know, what did you hear him on Drive Time? What do you have to say for that?
He was just making the case for Trump, I suppose, and what he said had nothing to do with him being banned. It was a completely separate issue. But in a subsequent broadcast, he said that. John, can you pick up on that and what happened there?
I mean, no, hang on. I actually was watching Steve Bannon through all of this, because his war room thing was one of the better things, because it was a young guy, Rich Barris, who's the kind of Italian man, who's just the most extraordinary Italian. He's about 35, and he's an absolute genius, mathematical genius, predictive genius, you name it. So he was, I mean, that's why I was watching all this on Tuesday night. I was watching him intermittently. He came on, and he was able to give you a clear picture of what had happened everywhere, county by county. Now, the quote from this is absolutely laughable. And this shows you, this goes to precisely the corruption of the media, which has been putting out this headline that Steve Bannon called for the beheading of Anthony Fauci. That is absolute nonsense. Everybody's heard the phrases like "heads must roll." You know, I want his head on a plate. Does that mean, when you say, if the Taoiseach calls for, says, I want the Minister for Finance's head on a plate, does that mean that he's ordering somebody to go out and behead the Minister for Finance and take, it means that he wants to fire him, right? That's what it means. That's what he said. Bannon said, I want to see his head on a pike. That's what he said. No, see, this is the interesting thing about media, because they're so, it's hard to come up with words to describe the mendacious and malevolent disposition of media in recent times. The lying they do, the absolute petty spitefulness of them. It's quite extraordinary. Like, this is, they know what it means, but they pretend they don't. So they pretend that they don't understand humor, they don't understand a figurative term, a metaphor, an ironic comment. They don't understand anything. You are caught on the literal interpretation. So we go back like 379 years in history of cultural development in order to deliver the media's agenda, right? On a given issue, on an issue like that. Steve Bannon did nothing, only speak figuratively about, he used a loose phrase to say, I want him fired. I want to see the back of Fauci, right? Which kind of half or 3/4 of America wants at this stage, right? Now, the thing about Bannon is, I don't agree, by the way. I think he's become a very significant player in this whole thing since that episode. That's why he was taken out. It wasn't because of that. This is, we're mixing up kind of pretext and effect, and you see, the reason that he was taken out was suddenly Bannon was back. His war room was making inroads. Because a very interesting thing happened. I was watching him on the day after they said it, the Wednesday, right? I was watching that day, and he was very downbeat. And he was using a kind of defeatist language, which is not like him. What he was saying, this day will go down in infamy. And he kept repeating that phrase, and he was very melancholy. And really, and I thought, and that was kind of like the mood, like what's happened? How can they do this? How can they seize this? And then the next day I switched him on and he was totally different. He says, no, forget all that. We got this. We got this. And he was actually literally issuing instructions to the White House from behind his own microphone. And he was saying, get your ass down to Pennsylvania. Rudy's on the way. He was talking to Rudy Giuliani and Rudy was about to head for Pennsylvania. Bannon was back in his old job. I don't think he ever got fired by Trump. I'm not sure what happened there, but I don't think they got on. I'd say both personalities, they're kind of great. They're two different kinds of guys and yet two very similar guys in other ways. And so I think that Bannon, but Bannon now is back in the driving seat. That's why he was taken out by Twitter, because he's a very powerful, very charismatic figure. And he called this, he got them to motivate, because you got to remember, you see, that the Republican Party has never really, most of it had really, Trump is not a natural Republican. He was a kind of a cuckoo in the Republican nest. And
well, if you listen to speeches from Bill Clinton, State of the Union from Bill Clinton in the mid-90s, you will hear almost exactly the sort of things that Donald Trump says. He's just a Democrat from 20 years ago, really.
Yeah, that's right. And he was friendly with John Kennedy Jr. and all that. So like that was he's a New York Democrat, really. But that's another story about what's actually happened to Trump and what Trump kind of discovered and how he discovered what is now his base and all that. We talked a bit about that before. But I think that Trump is actually now in a situation where the Republican Party really, he wants to see the back of him. Victor David Hanson kind of talked about this for the last few years. He used to talk about it in kind of metaphors from Westerns, like it was like, Shane or that once he's done the dirty job as the gunslinger who comes to clean up the town, the townspeople will want him to leave, right? And because he's kind of like, he reminds them too much of, because his methods are unusual. He's not all that nice. And, they just say, oh, can you go now? And he goes. So like all those bad guys, all those good guys, they always ride away into the sunset at the end, And so I think that's a very accurate metaphor. And you can see it now where the Republicans want their party back from Trump. But they won't be able to do anything with it, you see. They don't understand what Trump's done to it or to its base. They don't understand Trump's people, the Trump tribe. They have no idea what that's all about.
Well, the fascinating thing about that base thing is that, well, again, there's usefulness in the term, and we can picture the typical Trump voter at the rally and all that. But Trump has done incredibly well among traditional non-Republican voters, who, John, I remember you telling me, the way you put it probably about a year ago now, over a year ago, was the Democrats have co-opted minorities. And you had some serious support among minority groups for Trump. Kevin, can you talk to me a little bit about what you know of identity
This
politics
is
and all of that? Because you've been observing this for quite a while and longer than most people, I think.
This is something that I noticed overnight as I was seeing some counts come in. Turned out that Donald Trump had done better than he had in 2016 with pretty much every demographic, except apparently white men. He'd gone down about 5% with white men, and then up with white women, up with black women, up with black men, up with Hispanic women, Hispanic men, and then I think there was other, and he got up with them as well. And this was something that I suppose made me kind of optimistic that if he did win, that it might manage to shift, or it might help to shift a kind of slightly dangerous narrative, I suppose, or perception that Democrats are, or the Republicans are just a sort of white supremacist or a party of white people in general, and then Democrats are for everybody else. Because that's a very dangerous situation to have. Because I suppose if you look at the course of human history, all you really need to start a fight is two groups of people who see themselves as different, for whatever reason. It doesn't have to make sense, as long as two groups of people see themselves as different for some reason, and are in close proximity to each other. Eventually, you're going to get people fighting. And what I suppose one of the fantastic things about the USA has been that it was not set up, I suppose. It's not like Ireland is, like, where a bunch of people walked over with stone axes 10,000 years ago, then a whole lot of other stuff happened, and now here we are. The USA, as opposed to the ground itself, the institution of the United States of America was started as a specific decision to set up a country based on a set of principles, and as long as you held to those principles, as long as you believed in those principles, it didn't really matter very much where you had come from, or your sort of or your family background, etc. Which seemed to have been somewhat lost. There's a constant accusation, I suppose, that Donald Trump has been divisive, has been sort of dividing America. You hear an awful lot that it's now Joe Biden's job to help heal these divided states of America, is the phrase I keep hearing. But it is worth remembering that traditionally the thing that has held Americans together would be the Constitution, would be, I suppose, before that, the Declaration of Independence and the principles outlined in that. And in general, it's not Donald Trump, I don't think, who's been undermining those principles. Like, and this is something that's been going on for quite some time. And sorry, I kind of forgot what the question was initially.
Well, just with regard to the fact that he had won higher than usual votes among the minorities, and just your observations of this identity politics game that has been playing.
There's an interesting political analyst called Peter Zion, who might be worth watching, who believes that the traditional I suppose demographic loyalties of different groups of Americans is shifting, and this is a process that you see sometimes in a country. It usually takes about 12 years to sort of settle down, is what he says. And maybe that's what we're seeing. I believe Ben Shapiro has said that the future of the Republican Party is a coalition of Venezuelans, Cubans, and I suppose half the white people. Maybe more, maybe less, I don't know. But there does seem to be a bit of a shift, especially amongst certain groups of Hispanic people towards the Republican side. I believe Donald Trump beat Joe Biden very, very handily among Cubans, for example.
Yes, John, as Kevin has outlined, the American guiding principles are that no matter your group identity, you will be treated equally, and a very loudly articulated response to that, and I think in many ways a legitimate one, is that throughout the history of this country there has been classification of people based on their skin or their status as a slave or whatever. So how do we deal with that in a responsible way, that discrepancy historically, and coming to terms with the discrimination which was true, while also moving on without this kind of antagonism that we see in these debates today, specifically where group identity is concerned?
No, but you see, again, I think you've got to go back to the media. You see, all of this is noise created by media, or most of it, almost all of it is noise created by media. I mean, the racial situation actually de facto in the United States is infinitely better than it has been. You know, and if you hear somewhere like Thomas Sowell, like a black man, like that's what he'll tell you. You know, he'll break it all down in stats, and he'll tell you that all of this is actually media disinformation, or most of it is media disinformation. Of course, there will be occasional incidents. Trump isn't. If you actually talk to people in Ireland, for example, and you ask, it's a kind of almost a kind of as a matter of course, people in Ireland feel the responsibility to begin every conversation by talking about that idiot in the White House, you know. And if you challenge them, they'll say, well, he's a racist. Well, here's the proof of it. Like, he's got more votes from minority voters than any other Republican candidate for, like, I think the last one was Richard Nixon in 1960, right? So, like, that shows you that this is completely bogus. You know, one of the things they do, you see, is they conflate illegal immigration as part of the race narrative in America. But I mean, America and all countries have always maintained their borders. And America maintained its borders very robustly under Barack Obama and under Bill Clinton, as much as it has done under any Republican president, if not indeed more, and to some extent under Clinton. So this is bogus, is the point. It's race baiting by the media in order, it's another instrument to attack Trump with. And the reason they want to attack Trump is not because of his hair, not because he's not a nice guy on Twitter, not because of he's a misogynist or a racist or anything like that. It's because his agenda is to dismantle the situation that they are building their agenda into.
But I would make a distinction between the anti-Trump sentiment, though, and the racial wounds, I would say, that, like, you hear people talking about historical trauma, and I go to college, right, in America, and you hear people talk about African American studies, and it's a body of study, whether you think it's legitimate or not. But this has been around since before Trump. So I'm wondering, how can we view this situation, regardless of Trump, with a healthy view to the discrepancies that certain groups have felt throughout history, or do you not accept that that's a factor?
The first thing you need to do is remove the noise from the system. And when you have political interests using an issue falsely in order to inflate assertions and allegations that are baseless, then you can't actually have a truthful and honest and open discussion. You know, in my, admittedly somewhat relatively limited experience, the United States is a really balanced in terms of its accommodation of all multiplicity of minorities, getting on really well together. There are occasional flashpoints from time to time, but in general, what stuff we've seen this year has been virtually entirely generated by media. By malevolent media activities, and again, if you hear somebody like Thomas Sowell talking about this is what he would be saying. So yeah, of course, everything can be improved, but what we're dealing with here, the conversation that has gone on for the past couple of years in the United States, or since Trump came in, is an entirely bogus conversation, because it is predicated on using this race baiting as an instrument to attract Trump. Trump, insofar as he has spoken or has moved in a way that could be in any remote sense interpreted as, attacking or discriminating against certain minorities. It has been in the context of staunching the inflow of illegal immigrants into the United States. And that's a legitimate function. In fact, it's a mandatory function for a president to take on. The first duty of any government in any country is protect your nation's borders.
I want to ask the two of you about what you made of the demonstrations and the activism that took place over the summer, to which you referred, John. Kevin, what did you make of that? And John, I presume you're referring to the aftermath of George Floyd's death. Am I right in thinking? Yes.
Well, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, in
Kevin,
general. There's more stuff behind that, but that's been the flashpoint.
The flashpoint, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing that seems to be lost, I think, is just how gigantic the United States of America is, especially compared to somewhere like here. If you take the first 15 countries to join the EU, and then you take away like Britain or Italy, you're looking at roughly the population of the USA. And if you take the whole thing together, the police kill roughly 2.8 people a day, I think, across the entire United States, which is an awful lot more than European police collectively kill. But the ones that you hear about are the ones that are selected. Now, whether an actual there isn't a grand conspiracy among cats to kill birds and small animals. They just kind of do it because that's how they live. That's how they survive. You don't necessarily need a sort of explicit conspiracy or even an implicit conspiracy to sort of amplify certain events, because it's just in the nature, it's just naturally in the interests of news media groups to bring attention to things that are interesting. Now, the particular manner of George Floyd's death made it far more sort of naturally attention-grabbing than the average police-involved death in the USA. And there'll be a natural temptation, I think, to weave it into a narrative that is easy to tell on TV, a story that's easy to tell, that grabs people's attention. Additionally, I think there was probably an awful lot of pent-up energy. People sort of confined to their homes, people, which may kind of at least partially account for why there were demonstrations in other parts of the world as well. You had demonstrations, Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Northern Ireland of all places, which Northern Ireland has its own history of police brutality, but not against African Americans. It was against one half or just under one half of the population of Northern Ireland already. They don't need an extra reason to protest against police brutality, really. However, one thing I would say was I was kind of a little bit unimpressed by the American Medical Association sort of coming out and saying that, it's perfectly okay to protest for this, get out and protest for this, but if you protest for anything else, especially against lockdowns, you're going to get coronavirus, you're going to get COVID and die. But you can go out and protest against police brutality because that's a public health issue, which means that COVID just sort of doesn't count. I thought that was probably that was an act probably of cowardice more than anything else.
And there seems to be a similar thing going on in Ireland with protests there. There seems to be an inconsistency with how they're dealt with. Maybe John has more experience of that.
Yeah, well, there is. I mean, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, in fact, you're talking there about two global phenomena, COVID and cultural Marxism, because that's the brand that has gone universal in the world, and particularly among in academia, in the media, and so on. So what actually happened there was quite complex and confusing, but you can straighten out some of the strands of it very simply. the Floyd death, it was on the face of it, it's yet to go to trial, so there's, I'd say, stuff to come out yet. But on the face of it, it was pretty barbaric, and it shouldn't have happened. And but at the same time, Floyd was a very unlikely global hero, considering that his last crime was putting a loaded gun to the belly of a pregnant woman and threatening to shoot herself and her baby. Like, not exactly, a Martin Luther King, is he? So this nevertheless went like wildfire around the world, and we saw, this is the most terrifying thing about it. We saw the institutionalized hypocrisy and double speak of authorities, who on the one hand were battering lockdown protesters across the head with batons, and the next day they were taking the knee for George Floyd. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen so shameful an exhibition of official hypocrisy and really, I would say, dangerous dissembling in the face of the democratic right to assemble. That one category of person is allowed to do it on one issue and the other is battered into the ground for doing it. And I don't think that's unconnected. I mean, in a certain sense, COVID is also highly ideological, and exactly in the same way. If you actually look at the situation, interestingly, in the context of the American elections, it was COVID that made it possible. That's why I don't think this is such a universal issue in terms of fraud. There were particular circumstances which were almost, I mean, COVID went into the situation and created precisely the kind of situation to postal, the postal voting thing, which was a result of COVID. Also, the separation of tables and people in counting centres was due to COVID. That's the excuse they were using all the time to prevent people coming near to see what they were doing. Was, oh, COVID, keep your distance. So, all of these factors, it's very interesting, and in fact, if you go back and look, I wrote an article recently in Front Page Mag about the ideology of COVID-19. And it's very interesting when you actually look back at it. Like in April, say, they made about the half dozen states which had the highest number of deaths. In fact, they had well over 50% of the deaths in America between them. They were all Democrat run, and with New York at the top. And that followed on from an order issued by Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York State, on the 25th of March, which ordered that people would be allowed back into nursing homes without being tested for COVID. Now,
actually, sorry, I was just going to say, I actually read that order. I found it pretty shocking, especially in an American context. When the government here, announced that it was going to take maybe not complete control, at least partial control over private hospitals and the likes. I sort of, asked a couple of people in my social circle, like, is the government actually allowed to do that? And general consensus was, well, it's a crisis, so maybe they can do it temporarily. But that's in Ireland. In the USA, where sort of private property rights are so fundamental, I suppose, to the way the place works. Reading that order from Andrew Cuomo saying that you will take patients from hospitals to your nursing home, many of which would have been privately owned and privately run, and you're actually not allowed to require a negative COVID test before they go, seemed very extreme.
So what was the rationale behind that, where you couldn't establish if they had the virus?
To get people out of the hospitals, so the hospitals wouldn't be overwhelmed.
But why not test them? Why not test them?
That would delay things, I suppose. Takes usually takes a day or so to get the result back.
That's a benign interpretation. I mean, I would hazard a much more less benign one, that they just didn't care about the people in the nursing homes, and just decided, so be it. And that wasn't confined to New York, nor was it confined to the United States. I mean, well over half the deaths attributed to COVID, and I use those words advisedly, happened in Ireland in nursing homes. This is a massive scandal on the face of it. that has yet to be investigated. And again, for the reasons we're talking about in general about the media, this is not being focused on. It's not being prosecuted in the way it would have been by the media 15 or 20 years ago. For sure, they would have been on this on day one and would have been chasing it day after day, and would be the headline on the paper every day and the headline in the news and so on. Nothing. And this is, again, there's only one word for this. It's corruption. And this is a fundamental problem with all of this. In a certain sense, we're wasting our breath talking about the logistics of elections and personalities and candidates and diseases and nursing homes and all the rest of it, when in fact the mechanism by which we know anything, by which I mean the society can know anything, is corrupted. Therefore, there's no point.
That being the media.
We're wasting our breath in a certain sense.
The fourth estate. Well, John, Kevin said something about the protesters, and I want to ask you about your experience, if you don't mind, where you brought a good friend of yours to the Garda station and the hospital after she was attacked for putting up a sign over the road. I'm talking about Gemma O'Doherty, and I think you were down in Wicklow, and you were treated fairly forcefully. Do you mind talking about that and what happened there?
I wasn't there when it happened. I mean, she was engaging in it wasn't exactly a protest. It's more of an information campaign. It was like hanging banners on a bridge down in Kilmacannog, which is about 15 miles outside the centre of Dublin on the Wicklow side, just across the Wicklow border. It's I think a pedestrian bridge that goes across the N11. And there were some people there, and they do this all the time. And the guards the police had previously told them that they weren't breaking any law by doing that. And this particular guard came along, and the two guards came along and started telling them they had to take down the banners and clear off. And they said, well, we've been told there's no law. What law are you using? They refused to answer. And so there was a kind of a standoff. And then another guard, a senior guard, came on the scene, and he started ripping down the banners with a knife. And then he produced his notebook and started. And Gemma O'Doherty refused to give her name and refused to she kept asking him, what law are you using? He refused to answer. And the next thing, he jumped on her and handcuffed her. And she was taken into custody and brought down for several hours into Bray Garda station. I went down there. And when I arrived, they told me that then she was about to be released, but I had to wait for an hour. So they're now prosecuting her, Gemma O'Doherty, for a public order offence. You see, this is very sinister development, and I think this is, again, I mean, I don't say it's a global, because I've been watching the situation in the United States. I have to be honest, for all that we've been talking about police in the United States, and indeed authorities in general in the United States, my experience of authorities in the United States is far, far better than my experience of them in Ireland, for the reason that they're better trained. They're trained to behave formally. I mean, I'm talking in general now. They're very severe sometimes. I mean, if you go to the pre-clearance place in the Dublin airport, they're going to kind of like, you feel like you're on parade, and there's, can you stand right there, sir? Can you take one step backwards, sir? All this stuff, right? And I don't mind, I think. But actually, at the end of the encounter, time and again, I found that they'll say, have a nice trip now, sir, or say, John, I know you, I read your articles, very good, so, but in Ireland, it's all kind of loose and informal. And the law is kind of like, kind of a mush of different things. Nobody's quite sure what it is. And they're dumping one law in and then another law. And if that doesn't work, it's kind of like they're playing cards. So, okay, so here's my COVID law. Okay, now here's my Road Traffic Act. And by the way, here's the Public Order Act. Now I have you. I'm going to get you with something. And indeed, the Commissioner of Garda Síochána has said as much in public statements. He said that people who break COVID laws are also likely to break other laws. So in other words, he said, we'll get them for something. And that's what they're doing. And so, I mean, I don't know. I do think there's an element of this in the United Kingdom. we've seen a lot of that too. They've been but they've been given huge powers there, more than they have here. I mean, a policeman in the United Kingdom can actually fine somebody now £10,000 on the spot for breaching COVID rules. And these laws have never been tested in court. They've been delaying. There's a massive case there, the Simon Dolan case, which they've been kicking, just as they've been kicking our case down the road here, to escape the scrutiny of the courts, which eventually must come. But by the time it does come, this is their plan. It will be, as the lawyers say, moot. The law will have run out, and therefore there'll be no decision to be made. So this is anti-democratic. It's post-democratic. So in a sense, that's the theme that unites these things, Fergus. You know.
Yes, and yes.
That we're actually looking at, because, and I would put the blame again at the media, because the media, the fourth estate, is the instrument within a democracy that provides visibility and transparency and scrutiny. And when you remove that, inevitably the rule that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely starts to run rampant through the society.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the sign, was it the sign that was being put up down in Kilmechanic? It said RTE is the virus. Was that sign, or was that another one?
That was one of them. Yeah.
No, I saw that sign at RTE one day.
Yeah, they also have other ones about the vaccine and so on.
Okay.
There were several signs. There's just.
But again,
yeah.
You mentioned double speak and doublethink, and because I believe that one of the reasons the Gardaí were taking issue, or the reasons that they said there was a problem, was that it would be distracting to the drivers driving down the road, when every single election cycle these walkways are littered with election posters,
That's right.
And that's okay,
That's right.
So
or indeed football matches, the same thing. I mean, and nobody ever complains. Like if if the Dublin team put up banners on the way into Dublin for the All-Ireland, if they're in the All-Ireland final, nobody. But indeed, like by the same token, I mean, if you're driving along a motorway, every single road sign is in the same position. So if you want to know whether you go to Castlebar or to Cork, you've got to look at the signs here in the same position. It's literally, you glance up. It's completely disingenuous and dishonest to claim that this is distracting for motorists. This is the kind, this is what I'm talking about. Like they just make stuff, they just pluck it out of their arses, and this is what drives people absolutely crazy, that there's absolutely no solid foundation to any of this. And it's become particularly so visible in the COVID, because they know that the COVID laws are so flimsily founded and constructed that they have no legal basis, and that they will fall as soon as they're tested. That's why they're trying to keep us at bay, because we know this, and we've been saying this for 7 months, that the laws have no fundamental basis. I mean, if you go back and look, just briefly, people won't understand this, and I don't want to go into it, it's slightly complicated, but the package of laws essentially is based, it's regulations, and the regulations are essentially done by a minister, but they need to have a legal basis. Well, the legal basis is that they're rooted in an act which was written, the 2020 Health Act, which is connected, as it were, plugged in to the 1947 Act. So, okay, that's the package: 47 Act, 2020 Act, and regulations. But one of the things you need for this to be, kosher, is that the tenor and the spirit of the legislation be maintained consistently through the three elements. So you have to go back then and look, well, what is the spirit and tenor of the 1947 Act? It's about infections. And essentially it requires one thing, that doctors are required to register and report cases of notifiable infectious diseases. And the people who are found to be infected are to be amenable to various measures, whether it be quarantine or whatever, isolation, whatever it might be. But the point is that that's the ethic. So the central ethic is infectious people. The instruments have been used to create a law which allows people who are not even tested, who are not remotely suspected of having any condition, to be amenable to the same kind of measures as if they were. That's completely unconstitutional. It's completely illegal. It's completely irrational. It's completely crazy. And yet that's what they're doing. So and they're bullying people with this, instead of, because people now actually, I've noticed actually recently in Ireland that because people don't know, and the guards don't know what the law is about, or they're just bluffing. And the people are actually allowing themselves to be bluffed. So we've got to stage now where, like, if a guard told you to get out of your car and stand on your head in the road, people would assume that was necessary under the COVID legislation. And they would do it. Something we've got to.
Something we touched on briefly earlier was the founding principles of the USA, and that sentence in the Declaration of Independence about how people are, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. There's a huge amount actually in that sense, the statement that rights don't come from the government. They already exist. Everybody's born with them, whether you believe the creator is a god or, just the universe.
Yes.
Do you think maybe we just don't have the same concept of rights in Europe, possibly because Europe was just a bunch of monarchies for so long. And then sort of democratic governments just sort of slid in to fill the gap. Is it possible we just don't have the same concept of our own inviolable rights that allows?
No, it's not that, Kevin, because in fact, you're right about Europe in general, the continent of Europe, but Britain and Ireland have the same basis of their laws as the United States has. It's common law, because it's the British system essentially, and it's one of the great things about that Britain has bequeathed all of us. I think that the basis of common law is so good, because the fundamental principle of common law is precisely what you said there, that the people may do anything except that which they, the people, expressly forbid. The government may do nothing except that which the people expressly permit. That's an entire inversion of where we are now, in a sense. You see what I mean? Like, it's the people who make the laws, who require the laws, who are, but now we're being told that the police have the right to basically decide what the law is. And a minister of the government, he doesn't even bother going to the parliament with the actual express regulations, which are the cutting edge of all of this. He doesn't have to, because they've created this kind of insulation in between, this kind of buffer zone, where there's no connection between the regulations and the law. And Johnson Sumption has been talking about this in the United Kingdom, about the former judge of the Supreme Court, very brilliantly for the last 6 months. He's been saying the same things about the way that we now have government by decree, whereby the government, the minister is basically writing legislation, with huge fines, huge penalties. And the thing is being blocked from scrutiny by the parliament on the one side, but also from the courts, because the ball is being kicked into touch every time that it comes into play. But you see, this is interesting. We have, and this is the central question, Kevin and Fergus, about this, because that word inalienable, is incapable of being given up or taken. Imprescriptible is the other word. That these laws cannot be given up, cannot be taken away, and cannot be eroded over time. Now, that implies a certain absolute quality, but that's actually not quite correct, in the sense that there is obviously, all rights are amenable to encroachment from the state in certain situations. But the question that the courts have to decide is where that balance can be and in what circumstances. And it really is the principle that operates is something like the whole question of, if somebody's house is on fire and they want to put a ladder up from the next door garden and the person isn't home, you don't have to go to court to get a court order to go in and put the ladder in the garden to get up to the top window to get the person out, and the person doesn't need to be there. You can, you can do it ex parte, shall we say. You can do it. And that's the principle on which this whole thing can be decided. If there is an emergency, then we just do what needs to be done, right? But what we're actually dealing with here, we're way past, we're 8 months down the road now in this, and there's no emergency at all. And I've just heard yesterday in Ireland, they've now extended the face mask legislation to next June, with deaths from COVID in the present phase at statistical zero. It's quite phenomenal.
So John, just to clarify, that's the first I heard of that. Are you saying that you have to wear the mask in public in Ireland until June?
Not in public, in shops, in certain places in public buildings and so on. Not in the actual street yet. Yes.
Wow.
But on the topic of common law, I used to work in tourism, and sometimes I'd have a group of tourists for a couple of days at a time, and we'd end up getting through pretty much the whole history of Ireland as we were going around. I know I've forgotten a fair bit of it since, but one thing that I often mentioned was William and Mary's return to England in what they called the Glorious Revolution, 1688, and the fact that the Second Amendment, for example, of the American Constitution, has a direct lineage to the Bill of Rights that the nobles made William sign when he came. And actually, one of those things was that the Protestant population of Britain, of England and Wales, was he Scotland as well at that stage? Was he? Yes, I think he was. Were allowed to keep and bear arms, as befitting their need. And I'd sort of say, you might wonder then why, say, British people aren't allowed to have guns, and that is because Britain doesn't have a formal written constitution the same way as the USA does, so the Parliament can do pretty much whatever it wants. The only real defense against that is a kind of historical memory in the population at large, where people would recognize, wait a second, we've always been allowed to do this. This isn't how we do things here. And people would have to be taught that, from school age on, really. And if they're not, you end up with, what George Orwell liked to call that, that eternal present where the party is always right. That people have no concept that the government is supposed to have limitations, always had limitations. And so they'll just accept anything that's decreed from an authority figure, really.
Kevin, do you think that, this might sound crazy, but do you think there'd be a case to be made in Britain and Ireland and in Europe for something comparable to the Second Amendment to be in place or in existence? Like what you have in America, basically, where you're allowed to have a gun.
Well, I'm in an extreme minority here among anybody outside the USA, but I don't actually agree that the government has the same right that it thinks it does to restrict what you might have, what a private citizen could have in terms of weaponry and the likes, as long as they're not criminal, as long as they haven't committed any crimes. It was an assumed right throughout what is, I suppose, the what is sometimes called the Anglosphere. It was assumed that you had the right to keep weapons at home, up until relatively recently in sort of historical terms. The first time Britain really introduced restrictions on what weapons you could have was during the Irish War of Independence. And then, of course, any revolutionary government, any new government that's been born out of revolution is going to have its legitimacy on a kind of shaky ground for a while, at least. So obviously the new Free State government had no interest in letting people have their rifles back. Britain restricted private ownership of weapons a huge amount more in the 70s. One famous example, of course, is Australia in the 1990s. I don't remember which year it was exactly, after a mass shooting there in Port Arthur. And whenever that is spoken about, you will hear people say that when they took everybody's guns away in Australia, the rate of murder involving guns went down massively. But if you look at the overall murder rate in Australia, there doesn't seem to be any difference. There's no real difference in the suicide rate either, and all other crimes actually seem to go up quite a bit. So I don't see any evidence, any sort of convincing evidence that not letting people have their own weapons actually helps in any measurable way. And while it's not like I'm hiding a stash of guns in the house. I believe the Offensive Weapons Act in Ireland is not something that is morally actually defensible, because I don't think the state actually has that right to limit to that extent what you're allowed to have in terms of weaponry.
John,
if you're not a criminal.
If you're not a criminal, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah. John, what do you make of that issue?
Well, I broadly agree with Kevin. I mean, it seems to me that the evidence overwhelmingly shows that when you have laws against possession of guns, you keep the guns out of the hands of good, honest, decent people, but you don't stop them getting into the hands of bad people. And that's what continues, and that's what actually happens. You have an imbalanced society. You have a greater danger then for people who are unable to, in a situation where they're unable to defend themselves if the situation arises. And unfortunately, because of a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the mayhem generated by corrupt media and by the lack of visibility and the increasing corruption of so many things in our society, our mayhem is beginning to become commonplace in a lot of our societies now. And I think we're going down that road. And the time will come where, whether legal or illegal, many people will have to find ways of acquiring guns in order to protect themselves if this kind of politics continues for much longer. And I don't see anything stopping it, because the day when you had responsible, sober men and women in grey suits who, you know, at a certain point would bang the table and call everybody to order, that's gone now. I mean, you saw that. When you see police commissioners taking the knee to rioters like and looters, you have to ask yourself, what the hell is happening in the world? And in that situation, I mean, you know, people, ordinarily working people, have no protection, because the police is actually on the side of the criminals, and therefore the police itself has become criminal. And that's what we're seeing here in Ireland in different ways. And we had it before in the north of Ireland, but we have it now here big time. Today, actually, there were 6 police officers suspended in County Cork for corruption of some kind. That would never have happened 30, 40 years ago. The training is deficient. The ideology is poisonous. And the media is not doing its job. The media have abandoned their post. And that's a very dangerous situation for society.
When you talk about the media, obviously you're referring to specific actors, right? And you would say that there's I hope I'm not mischaracterizing your position, but I think you would say that there's a poison that has infected the vast majority of mainstream organizations and individual journalists, right? And is there no space, like, could there not be a distinction made between these, say, current actors, and on the other hand, you have the role that could be fulfilled by anyone? As in, what is there to stop another, or is it plausible that in time, more functioning, less dysfunctional organizations and individuals will fulfill these roles? Or do you think that the corruption is so systemic that that's not really possible?
That's a really great question, Fergus. I'm not sure that I have an answer, but I can certainly tease it out in terms of what the forces are that are there now. And it's not that clear cut. I mean, the alternative media, you see, one of the things, there's a lot of alternative media coming on stream. And of course, there's a certain chaotic dimension to a lot of that in terms of the formatting and the presentation and so on. Not present company obviously accepted for that. But, you know, it's very early days. It reminds me very much, actually, in a certain way, of when I started off in hot press like 40 years ago. And, you know, there was this kind of counterculture emerging. Now, up to that point, the media in Ireland had been, now I don't regard it as a flaw now, but I did then, you know, very grey and, you know, very, you know, bland and, you know, kind of almost articles read like official documents more than they did like articles do now. Very state. And we came along with Hot Press and in Dublin, McGill, all these publications, Hibernia, which were countercultural and you know, different, more informal and so on. And that kind of then had an organic effect on the mainstream, and it made it more like that, to the point where it became too much like that, and now it's gone crazy. And then of course the media, the counterculture fell away. And in a certain sense, the mainstream became the counterculture. And now you have this new counterculture coming forward, which may, I think, in due course, but you know, have an effect. But what's actually happening now in this period of transition, or whatever it is that you have all these bizarre kind of cross currents, like the messages being put out. You could see it in the election or in the COVID thing, you know, that the mainstream put out this message that don't trust anything online, don't trust anything on social media, come to the proper official sources. Whereas in fact, the official sources are the most corrupt and unreliable of all, frankly. And the other thing then is the idea that the conspiracy theory, like, you set up this idea that anything that isn't the official narrative is a conspiracy theory. And I know if I've spoken about this on this stream before, but in that phrase comes about, it was invented by the CIA precisely for the purpose of discrediting unofficial narratives. And it's a very interesting phrase when you think about it, because it has those two words, conspiracy and theory. Now, the word conspiracy has obviously a kind of a sinister undertone to it, But when you think about it, like virtually everything that happens historically, everything that has happened in history, whether it be a revolution or an assassination or a new party, everything comes about as a result of a conspiracy. So to be a theorist of conspiracy is simply to be a historian, That's what a conspiracy theorist actually is. But they've actually managed to upload, they flipped the words in a sense, and now they've uploaded all the sinister elements to the theorist, as it were. So, and in fact, there's actually a new word that's jumped out of this now, which is like normally the noun in that would be a conspirator. They've invented this new one, conspiracist, which again has all that sinister stuff. And this is what they've done. So that, and I mean, I find it all the time, like if you try to broach certain topics in front of certain kinds of people, they, oh, well, that's a bit of a conspiracy theory, But in fact, it's just simply an alternative hypothesis. It's some new information. Maybe it's not entirely verified, but still it's worth speculating about, discussing. That's what political discussion is. And we talked earlier about the idea of the watermarks on the ballots. And I said, well, I don't know if it's verified yet, but it's an interesting thing. Like, is it a conspiracy theory? What does it mean? So they've actually managed to blow up. The mainstream is continuously doing these kind of controlled explosions in the eyes of the public on the alternatives. And it's very successful, because people say, I wouldn't trust that YouTube, which is a ridiculous thing to say, because there's a multiplicity of things on YouTube. Obviously, I wouldn't trust YouTube as an organization, as a corporation, because it's Google and they're constantly censoring people. But still, despite that, there's a hell of a lot of good stuff on YouTube and on BitChute and on really YouTube, I think it's called now, which has come out recently. So I do think there's a revolution underway there, but I don't know where it's going to go or how long it's going to take, because YouTube is clearly wants to stall it now. Because one of the things that YouTube has seen, it's very interesting, that in the Trump era, and I don't like right and left labels anymore, I don't think they're very functional or useful, or even conservative, progressive, they're not particularly useful. But what we see actually is that a very interesting thing, that by and large, the people who have been best at using that tool that YouTube has offered have been people on what you might call the conservative, the right. For some reason, the kind of discourse that they've been able to create is much more effective than what the left has been able to generate in equal terms. They're better on Twitter and the short.
It's probably because the need is also there. You could say that we're already hearing the left view in the mainstream, and therefore there's an absence. Do you know what I mean, of the other one? And,
yeah.
And that's
I do think that's right. That's correct. But I noticed, and I haven't got the word, I must look this up now, but I came across an article there yesterday, which is analyzing this from a left-wing perspective or from a media perspective. And they were seeing all kinds of sinister things in the very fact that people were able to have these intimate discursive, variegated conversations. That this in itself is being perceived as a very sinister thing, that there's something they're doing. It's a kind of a magic. Yes. That the right is doing, that we need to get our to grips and try and stop it.
No, I'm reminded of when Jordan Peterson is taken up by his adversaries about the fact that 90% of your followers are men, as if this is some sort of crime, and he says, well, actually, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that to begin with, but also he points out that YouTube is a predominantly male-dominated platform. There are explanations for these phenomena, and again, what you say, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. To use that term, Kevin.
No, just when you say again, there doesn't always need to be, a conspiracy as such. One thing, my I suppose objection or question over lockdowns would be on a very different level to John's, I suppose. The way I see it, it's there, it's not nothing, but I'm not convinced it's worth cancelling everyone's wedding and making fun illegal. I'm not convinced it's that severe. However, I was watching video, a presentation not too long ago, from an anaesthetist about a thing called resuscitative thoracotomy, a process where you cut somebody's chest open to try and start their heart again. And if you ask a cardiothoracic surgeon, they will say emergency doctors should never do that ever. And yeah, fair enough. In somewhere like James with the matter, they shouldn't, because they're cardiothoracic surgeons to do it. But on the side of the road, when you're just driving a helicopter, it might be necessary. And one interesting thing he said was that if you're thinking of doing it, you should ask yourself first, are my intentions honorable here? Which seems like a slightly crazy thing to ask. Obviously you're trying to keep the person alive. Obviously you're trying to save the life. However, what he's recognizing is that you might get overexcited with the idea of being a hero. You might do something which isn't actually going to work, end up just effectively desecrating a corpse, because you get too excited, too enamored by the idea that you can, save the day. And something not too dissimilar might have happened with people when they're like, obviously on a larger and less immediate scale. People might just have got too excited by the idea that there's a major emergency going on that they can fix, that they want to play the hero. This is something that I think I might have seen a touch of with Leo Varadkar, when he was kind of playing Winston Churchill at the start of all this. It's possible that people who have been in politics forever have always wanted a nice big crisis that they can play the hero for, in the same way as a certain type of emergency doctor might sort of get a bit excited when they hear blue lights. Hear sirens and they see blue lights. They get to do something exciting. It's possible that there wasn't an actual sinister intent, but there may be, I suppose, psychological factors which led to a potential overreaction, or I suppose failure to. Initially, maybe it wasn't overreaction because it did look more like it would be more dangerous than it has necessarily turned out. But maybe a failure to sort of recalibrate our response to it.
Yes.
With I suppose sort of further information that actually it's probably not quite as dangerous as we first feared.
No, that's a very well made point. Sorry, go on.
That's a really interesting analysis, I think, Kevin. And I think you're right over the central question of all this. Now, this is exactly what should have been talked about at the very beginning and wasn't. The process by which this actually happened, and we still have to go into that because it's hugely complex in terms of, those tectonic plates that need to be kind of regulated and aligned between the philosophical and the legal and the medical and the political and the economic and the sheerly human. Those things were not aligned. That process did not happen. There was no due diligence. There was no weighing in the balance. That's the problem. And there was no kind of mature kind of deliberation by those men and women in grey suits that would bore us all, the pants of us all. But we so desperately need them now that, they're the kind of sober people that you could build your house on. Like they're so solid. And that's kind of, I think, fundamentally what we've been talking about all night, that there's been our societies are unraveling for the want of responsible adults. Which, by the way, is something that Robert Bly predicted years ago, about 25 years ago, in a book called The Sibling Society. He said this was going to happen, that we were going to end up with a society of rival siblings rather than as an adult of our society of adults and children.
John, I would love to keep this going. I'm over time in the room that I'm in, but I want to bring this all together because exactly what you talk about, these kind of leaders that we don't seem to have. You wrote about one of them, and this actually is uncannily applicable to the Steve Bannon case. So I'm going to read a snippet of an article that was written by you about an interview with Charlie Haughey. How many years ago? I don't know, but I think you'll know what I'm talking about.
36 years ago, I think.
I'm just going to quote it here because you can't word it better than it's been put here. So John asked Charlie Haughey. He wasn't Taoiseach at the time, right? He was in opposition.
He was leader of the opposition, yeah.
Yes. So what aspect of Ireland or Irish society angers you the most? And Charlie Haughey's response was, there's nothing really. I couldn't live anywhere but in Ireland. I'm not perpetually angry about anything. I might suffer minor irritations, exasperations or anger about particular things. But no, I like living in Ireland and in the Irish community. Here he pauses at length and reflects. He looks me straight in the eye before continuing. I could instance a load of fuckers whose throats I'd cut and push over the nearest cliffs, but there's no percentage in that. Laughs. Smug people. I hate smug people. People who think they know it all. I know from my own experiences that nobody knows it all. Some of these commentators who purport to a smug know-allness, who pontificate. They'll say something today and they're totally wrong about it. Completely wrong. And they're shown to be wrong about it. Then the next day they're back, pontificating the same as ever. That sort of smug, know-all commentator, I suppose, if anything annoys me, that annoys me. But I don't have sleepless nights about it. So the reason this is so comical to me is that he talks about slitting the throat, and it reminds me of Steve Bannon, you know. And no one banned Charlie Haughey 36 years ago from the media, you know. So anyway, I just thought that would be good to leave it at that.
Because exactly, and there was actually, I mean, people were in a certain sense scandalized, but it was the four-letter words. It wasn't they actually cutting people's throats.
Yes.
Particularly, I think people knew whose throats he was thinking of cutting, and they didn't necessarily think it was such a bad idea.
Right, well, Kevin and John, thank you both so much for this. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope that you two enjoyed it too. And of course, that if you were watching or listening to this, I would ask that you might consider sharing it with your friends. We have a fairly small following on this page and on this broadcast, and we are dependent on you to get the word out there in this alternative medium. That's it. Good evening. God bless. Good night.